So you want to start taking photos and videos, but you don't know where to start. Whether it's for photos or videos, I'm going to show you the best entry-level cameras out there. These cameras are both user-friendly and easy on the wallet. We review dozens of cameras on this channel every single year, so whether you're a beginner or a pro, I've got you covered. So be sure to check out the links in the description down below for the most up-to-date pricing on all of the products that we talk about today. So if you want to start shooting, the first thing you're probably looking for is a camera that's simple to use and also affordable. Let me introduce you to the Canon T7. The biggest selling point of this camera is that it's extremely easy to use and it's one of the most affordable cameras on the market. This camera is really simple and straightforward, kind of like an Apple product. The great thing about the Canon T7 is that it has great image quality and colors right out of the camera. This camera actually looks great even without editing. In terms of technology, the T7 has the same sensor that you see in more expensive Canon cameras like the 80D or the M50. It's a 24 megapixel APS-C size sensor. So despite being a budget camera, it gives you stellar image quality. But it does have a downside. This camera does not shoot very fast. It only shoots 3 frames per second in photo mode, which is good enough for casual shooters who are on vacation, maybe friends and parties. But if you're shooting something that's fast moving, like a pet, car, or a sports game, this camera will struggle. But thankfully, the autofocus in photo mode is spectacular. You'll be able to keep your subject in focus even if they're moving around a lot. However, video is where this camera really struggles and in my opinion drops the ball. In video mode, it shoots full HD up to 30 frames per second, but it doesn't have any slow motion options, and the video autofocus is just terrible. Video is kind of a nice to have in this camera, but I really wouldn't recommend this camera to someone who's focusing on video as a priority. This is really a beginner photo camera. But if you're a beginner video shooter, don't worry, I haven't forgotten about you. The T7 is rock solid. It's made of polycarbonate plastic, but I swear this thing is built like a tank. I would not hesitate taking this to the beach, long road trips, or just tossing it in your backpack. Although I will say I am not a fan of the 18 to 35mm kit lens. It's a great lens if you want to save money, but the quality is subpar in terms of sharpness and the overall look of the lens. Plus, it's not very good in low light. But don't worry, the Canon T7 does have a flash for those of you doing low light photography. And before I forget, the ergonomics on the T7 are phenomenal. Canon makes their products kind of like Apple products. They're minimal, simple to use, and very straightforward. And there's almost nothing in this camera that you'll never look at or never need. Everything is really neat and tidy, simple to use, simple to understand. You can honestly just pick this camera up, figure it out within 10 to 15 minutes and start getting great results. The T7 is a pretty great camera, but it does have 2 flaws that might make it a deal breaker for some of you. So because this is a budget camera, it does not have an articulating screen. The screen does not move, it's simply fixed to the back of the camera. And that becomes a problem when you're doing high angle or low angle shots because you have difficulty seeing the screen. Also, I don't imagine a lot of you guys want this camera for video, but one thing that I have to mention is that this camera does not have any sort of stabilization and it does not have a headphone jack for external audio. So overall, the Canon T7 is a phenomenal camera for someone that's just starting out with photos. But a lot of you guys also want to do videos and you want to be able to shoot photos faster. For you guys, the next camera just might be perfect, and that is the Nikon D3500. So the Nikon D3500 is the camera that I recommend the most often to not only people on a budget, but also people that I can sense are a little bit serious about their photos and videos. This camera is definitely for somebody who wants to edit their photos and videos and possibly wants to do it professionally one day. When it comes to technology, the Nikon has a 24 megapixel sensor, which is pretty standard, but it does shoot 5 frames per second, which is 2 frames faster than the Canon T7. And I know what you're thinking, it's only 2 frames. Trust me, you will see a difference. When it comes to shooting fast-moving objects like pets, cars, dogs, you're going to have a much easier time capturing that action. And something that most people don't know about Nikon cameras is that the RAW codec in this camera is extremely robust and it's going to give you a ton of room in editing when it comes to Photoshop and Lightroom. Oh, and before I forget, when it comes to video, this camera is also phenomenal. It does full HD at both 24 and 30 frames per second, but it does 60 frames per second for 2 times slow motion, which is a very rare thing to see in a budget camera like this. Plus, I'm happy to say the autofocus is fast and reliable in both photo mode and video mode. Again, that's a rare thing to see in a budget camera. But the one thing that might turn some of you off is the body and design. When it comes to design, the Nikon D3500 has a lot of the same problems as the T7, but not many of the benefits. Firstly, Nikon doesn't have the same minimalist philosophy, so there's a lot more buttons and the menus are pretty clunky. But it also has a fixed LCD screen on the back, so low angles and high angles will be tough with this camera. And it does not have an input for audio in case you plan on using it for video. The internal audio is decent enough, but it's nothing amazing. This is definitely a camera that's going to take a bit of getting used to, but I've had mine for about three and a half years, and I personally really like it. The D3500 is a phenomenal camera for someone who wants to get started with shooting photos and videos and is looking to really invest themselves and get serious about this as a hobby or as a potential career. This is definitely not a camera that I recommend to someone who's just doing this as a hobby. For you guys, you'll be much happier with the T7. Now the T7 and the D3500 are great cameras, but things like a fixed screen or the lack of an audio jack or just overall older DSLR technology kind of holds these cameras back despite being phenomenal DSLR cameras. So for the rest of this video, let's take a look at mirrorless cameras that are newer, have better technology, and have a lot more interesting features that modern shooters would want. Alright, so first let's talk about the Canon M50. The M50 has everything you love about Canon cameras and the Canon T7, but then it goes and adds all the modern bells and whistles technology-wise and design-wise that I personally felt the Canon T7 was missing. For starters, it has a side articulating screen that lets you film not only yourself, but also lets you shoot weird high and low angles or really any angle you want. But also it has touch autofocus. The side articulating screen is a touch screen that allows you to operate all of your camera just with that touch screen, so you actually don't need to use the buttons, but that touchscreen has touch autofocus, so you can simply tap something in your frame, it'll snap to focus, and then it will actually track it throughout your frame. Like I said, it's pretty amazing. Also, on top of that, it does have the excellent Canon minimalist design philosophy, so it has minimal buttons and minimal menu pages, plus it has an input for external audio for all my content creator and YouTubers out there, so you can finally get high quality audio with your camera. But, let's talk about the specs and technology in this camera. So when it comes to the sensor, it has the standard 24 megapixel sensor. And I know what you're thinking, gosh, everything has a 24 megapixel sensor. I wish I could make it spicier for you, but this is just the state of the camera industry. Which is exactly why I tell a lot of people you can do a lot with a beginner camera, and a lot of people don't even need a pro camera. However, where this camera does set itself apart is the fact that it shoots 10 frames per second. The T7 did 3, this camera does 10. That's a huge leap, which basically opens this camera up for any kind of subject matter or shooting style, because no matter how fast your subject's moving, you're going to be able to capture that action. On top of that, it's paired with 14-bit RAW, which allows you to create beautiful images and offers tons of flexibility when it comes to editing. This camera is truly a powerhouse. And when it comes to autofocus, I'm happy to say it's super fast, super reliable, and it not only does great work in photo mode, but also video mode. So let's talk about video. This camera does full HD up to 60 frames per second. It does 24 and 30 for real time, but now you get 2 times slow motion. And it also has 120 frames per second, but sadly in 720p, which isn't very sharp or detailed, but it's a really nice thing to have for 5 times slow motion. The Canon M50 does have 4K at 24 frames per second, but the 4K is pretty much pushing this camera to its limit. So in 4K mode, your sensor actually crops pretty dramatically, and basically in this mode you really can't get a wide shot, but 4K mode is useful if you're doing detail shots or if you're doing product reviews to really show the fine details on a product. And on top of that, in 4K mode, the autofocus switches to a contrast-based system, so all the fancy autofocus you have in this camera just kind of goes away. It becomes really slow and clunky like a DSLR. I would not use 4K mode with autofocus in this camera at all. But again, if you want high quality 4K with no crop and you want full HD at 120 frames per second for that super slow motion, I have you covered. The next camera covers everything you could possibly want in a camera, and that is the beast of the camera known as the Sony a6100. So, something that I have to mention, the Sony a6100 is mainly a photo and video camera. There is a camera known as the Sony ZV-E10, which is my top pick for beginner budget, beginner friendly. It's just an amazing camera, but because of everything that's going on, it's really hard to get your hands on, and Sony is having trouble getting this camera out to people. So if you were looking for the Sony ZV-E10, I recommend picking up the Sony a6100, and do not worry, I'm gonna explain what the difference between the a6100 and the ZV-E10 are. The Sony a6100 has a 24 megapixel sensor with a 14-bit RAW codec, But what makes the Sony a61 special and pretty much every other Sony camera out there is the fact that these cameras are low light monsters. Most cameras look pretty bad if you put them at 3200 ISO, but Sony cameras look good even at something as high as 20,000 ISO. That's a pretty big jump from 3200. So if you're looking for a low light camera, or you just find yourself in nightclubs or late night parties a lot, the Sony camera is probably your best bet. So when it comes to photos, the Sony a6100 and the ZV-E10 shoot at 10 or 11 frames per second. What's truly impressive about this camera, or really any Sony camera, is the autofocus. Canon has, I would say, 10 out of 10 autofocus. Sony has probably 15 out of 10 autofocus. It has not only intelligent face tracking, auto tracking, but it just has this speediness and responsiveness to the autofocus, which in my opinion makes the Sony cameras the most technologically advanced cameras on the market right now. And the spectacular autofocus holds true for both photos and video, which brings me to video. This camera has the best 4K that you can get right now at this price point. It does 4K at 24 with no crop, and it does 4K at 30 with a teeny tiny crop that I promise you will not notice it. The 4K is amazing. The 4K is also super sampled from 6K, which makes it much more detailed than regular 4K. Basically, you're getting an extra 2K. Plus, it does full HD at 120 frames per second for buttery smooth 5x slow motion, and it still does the standard HD at 24, 30, and 60. It basically fixes all of the issues the M50 had, the Nikon had, or the T7 had. However, when it comes to build and design, that's one place where I really wish Sony did things differently. The body is small and compact, and the button layout is pretty minimal, but the menu system is so cumbersome. I need a PhD just to understand how it is. It is hard to teach people how to use this camera, and it is hard to even learn how to use this camera, but that's okay because this camera is made for higher end professional use, and these are the kind of people that want pages and pages of menus because they want to be able to go in and tweak every little thing about their camera. Also, if you're wondering what the difference between the Sony a6100 and the ZV-E10 is, the ZV-E10 has a few things going for it. It has an internal audio system that's almost as good as an external microphone, so it's much better for vloggers or people that film themselves. It also has a side articulating screen, and its overall design is just more user-friendly for YouTubers and content creators. The Sony ZV-E10 also has built-in cinema profiles for properly color grading your footage. It has S-Log2, S-Log3, and a whole bunch of cinema profiles. Unfortunately, the a6100 only has standard color and it does not have cinema profiles built in. But the a6100 still has a ton of horsepower. I really recommend this camera to someone who's an early professional or someone who's really passionate about shooting photos and videos. So I've reviewed tons of cameras on this channel. I'm pretty in love with this stuff. But what really matters to get great photos and videos isn't the gear that you have, it's really the skills and knowledge. So if you want to use your gear to its full potential, I've created a free training in the link down below of my 7 simple secrets that will dramatically improve both your photos and videos today. So if you have any questions about the cameras we talked about today or the course, make sure to hit me up in the comments down below. And I hope to see you either in the comments or in the next video or in the course. We're gonna see each other again. See you next time.